Good morning. Pledge drives. Those of us who have Minnesota Public Radio programmed into our cell phones, computers, and car radios have just about had it up to here with the thought of pledge drives because, as you know, NPR is wrapping up their winter pledge drive, which will soon be followed by their summer pledge drive, and then their fall pledge drive, and so on and so on. And guess what? We come to church today and discover that we at the UU have launched our pledge drive. Although I have to tell you, as UUers, I think we do a much better job of beginning a pledge drive than NPR. Those of you who don't understand that reference, ask somebody who was at the variety show last night. Why do we do this pledge thing? The most obvious reason is that we have to. We needed to keep the lights on, to keep our programs going, to advocate for justice and love. And even though our minister over there is a great guy, I don't think he does his thing for free. Close enough, right? There's a deeper reason why we participate in pledge drives, I think. And that's because we have a need to be connected to something bigger than ourselves. We need to be connected to something that is important, that has value, and that makes a difference. And be assured, the work we do here at the First UU makes a difference. We practice inclusion. We teach about justice. We act to make the world a better place for those on the margins. Yes, we want to be connected to something important, and participation in the pledge drive helps us make that connection to a community that sustains us as we live, learn, and make a difference in Rochester. The theme for this month is wisdom, and with that in mind, we light the chalice. We believe that many streams join together to make a river, that the way to wisdom lies in an open ear and an open heart, and that goodness may be pursued for the sake of goodness and not from fear of punishment, and that knowing and not knowing are part of the same coin, and that ambiguity is a permissible thing. The first reading is titled Information by David Ignatow. This tree has 2,075,000 leaves. Perhaps I missed a leaf or two, but I do feel triumphant at having persisted in counting hand by hand, branch by branch, and marked down on paper with pencil each total. Adding them up was a pleasure I could understand. I did something on my own that was not dependent on others. And to count leaves is not less meaningful than to count the stars, as astronomers are always doing. They want the facts to be sure that they will have them all. It would help them to know if the world is finite. I discovered one tree that is finite. I must try counting the hairs on my head. And you should too. We could swap information. The second reading is called Numbers by Mary Cornish. I like the generosity of Numbers. The way, for example, they are willing to count for anything or anyone. 2 pickles, 1 door to the room, 8 dancers dressed as swans. I like the domesticity of addition. Add 2 cups of milk and stir. And the sense of plenty. 6 plums on the ground and 3 more falling from the tree. And multiplication's school of fish times fish, whose silver bodies breed beneath the shadow of a boat. Even subtraction is never loss. It's just addition somewhere else. 5 sparrows take away 2. Those 2 are in someone else's garden now. There's an amplitude to long division as it opens Chinese takeout, box by paper box. Inside every folded cookie, a new fortune. And I never fail to be surprised by the gift of an odd remainder, footloose to the end. 47 divided by 11 equals 4, with 3 remaining. 3 boys beyond their mother's call, 2 Italians off to sea, and 1 sock that isn't anywhere you look.
It's inch by inch and row by row, says the old song of how to grow a garden. It's adding up the pebbles and the rocks, all those things in the container of your life to see how it all shakes out to something strong and lasting and sustaining. Sometimes it's easy to get lost in all the numbers and the accounting of it all in this life. Like when before Christmas, there were a few of us here in the sanctuary trying to plan out enough seats for the Christmas Eve services. So we wanted to count and also be in line with fire code and be in compliance for the safety of us all. And you'd think it'd be easy to count chairs. They look so similar, though. And you keep going row by row, and eventually you're like, 79, or shoot, was that 89? And then you have to go back to the beginning an embarrassing amount of times to get the count right. To count the leaves, writes the poet, is not less meaningful than to count the stars. How do we quantify it all? How do we quantify what we do in church or any place of deep meaning in our lives? There are some answers to that question in a book in my office entitled Church Administration and Finance in Context, Volume 4. It's amidst a handful of other real page-turners from theological school about church budgets and administration and governance, which I'm sure you all have in your own personal collections. You read them regularly. But really, when it comes down to it, beyond the systems and styles of how to technically hold it all together, how do you measure? How do you track, enumerate? How do you do description and explanation and profession of the value that this place gives, of the value those places in your life offer you, or any place that adds to the quality of your life? How do you accurately account for the amount of times that someone comes in these doors with their heart, their soul, their world just broken open, broken apart, shattered, seemingly beyond repair, and they find here, if only for a breath or for a lifetime, a place to bring their grief, a place for their soul to land, to rest, to breathe, to be? How do you accurately quantify the amount of moments someone has been asked to share their story and someone else's heart has been broken open because of that story, changing their life in some small but beautiful way? How do you measure the amount of love that happens when someone finds a religion, a community that says your beliefs, your doubts, your identity, your ethnicity, your gender, your sexual orientation, your gender identity, it's sacred here. It's beloved, no matter what else you have been told before? How do we track and keep record of the ways in which we minister to each other? How do we count all the casseroles and the bars and the cards and the calls that are made and hand-delivered to someone's home or someone's bedside or just right downstairs to the kitchen to spread a feast on a Sunday morning or a Wednesday night to nourish souls who have come in these doors maybe only one time in their life just to mourn a loved one gone, and they find a feast spread for them? How do we monitor, count the ways that we show up for one another, that we show up in our community, providing meals for those in need, providing supplies for those with limited means, providing voice and presence and protest in legal defense, and so much more? It is this type of accounting, this accounting of spirit and soul, that any church, any good religion is about. And it is about all the little details that we track mightily close. about the price of paper towels and half, the cost of utilities and snow removal and cleaning supplies. It is about all of this, the craft supplies for children to make and then the caring team to address and deliver Valentines. It's about health insurance and being an ethical employer. It's about blocks, both cinder and Lego. It's about books, political and picture. It's about tissues in the sanctuary and in the classroom. And it's about curriculum and candles and crayons and coffee and chalice oil. Because every little one of those details means that we are supplying our mission in the world, that we are in every way we can providing the material and the container, practical and philosophical, for deep welcome and compassion, for nurturing spirituality, and for practicing justice. This is what we're about. The way that the poet talks about counting the leaves on that finite tree, like tracking the decimals in our finite budget, because it allows us to do the equally important task of counting the stars, of imagining the impossible, in the realms of the hard, if not impossible to quantify, the realms of love and of justice and of hope. But it's the little leaves and all those little details that help us create the spaces where we engage the largest questions of life in the common, the ordinary, as well as ancient practices of singing together and eating together and serving together. Because we know this is a world that is bartering for our attention and our resources all the time, a world that wants to define us by our worth by what we own or what we buy. But there are some things that money can't buy. And there are things that we're actually about much deeper than that, and those are the things that we live by and that we give and we receive from each other. We receive and give so much in this world and in this church by the caretaking and the curating of beauty and hospitality. From you I receive, and from you I give. I caused a little anxiety a few months back as we were preparing for our annual service of All Souls, honoring our ancestors with an altar of memory and of candlelight that Sunday. Part of a similar tradition in Central America, which you likely know, Dia de los Muertos. At many of those gatherings, there are marigolds placed around the graves of loved ones. So I asked a few folks, could you find some marigolds for the altar? Yes, they said, and not being the most green thumb around, I didn't really think about the weather and how cold it had gotten early this October, and how the marigolds just might be a little off schedule to these green thumbs. So quickly, not bothering me and worrying the poor little minister's mind about it, they started their own almost Unitarian Universalist style prayer chain. Calls began to happen between the known gardeners asking, how are your marigolds? Are they presentable? How are yours? We need to find some on the roadside because these are horrible. People were caretaking their marigolds with liturgical care and searching for along the roadsides for the best possible ones, because they knew and they felt when you're asked to provide something beautiful to honor ancestors, it better be good. And come Sunday morning, little did I know, came baskets and Tupperware arrived, some wilted, some fresh, some kept in refrigerators, all of which were filled with just the right amount of love. And the altar was spread, and there was enough, more than enough, to make beautiful, to make blessed by the marigolds, and even more so, by the care of those loving souls who knew how much it mattered to care for this church and to provide beauty right from a ditch somewhere, because they knew they needed to. That's what the poet calls the generosity of numbers. That in this life, if we're lucky, we're surrounded by people and communities and beauty that have an attunement of the heart toward love and toward joy. And when we're in those places, we often get so much more than we know or thought possible. The poet says, I never fail to be surprised by the gift of an odd remainder, footloose at the end. 47 divided by 11 equals 4, with 3 remaining. How true that is. The most meaningful, most nourishing, most important things in our life are often those odd remainders we didn't anticipate or plan for. which maybe is a good general description of many Unitarian Universalists, odd remainders from other religions that come and gather here. But it is those odd remainders, those unexpected things. After you thought everything was spent, everything used up, all was accounted for, it isn't the things but the meaning of things that show up as little gifts of grace, full of color and life, to shine up a Sunday morning and any morning. Sometimes that happens all on its own. Most of the time it happens because people work hard to build the context and the circumstances, to search the roadside and enter their world, their home, their work, a meeting, a forum, a conversation with openness instead of rigidity, with curiosity instead of judgment, with abundance instead of scarcity, with ambiguity instead of certainty, with what the Reverend Eliza Tupper Wilkes, who I mentioned last week, who was minister here 150 years ago, who has seemed to be staring a little more closely, even more so this week at me, if you were here and heard last week's sermon. She says, what we have in this faith to offer is an abundance of hope and good cheer. What if we enter spaces like that more often? I see it all the time in this church. You show up for yourself, for each other, for your neighbor. You show up and then you get to work and you imagine the impossible and you create something beautiful to stretch your soul and your spirit, your mind, by asking hard questions, by staying at the table through hard conversations, by entering the tension, which is life and the world and church, with grit, with grace. Most of you know that I have young children, 6 and 3 years old. Some of you may know that that often means there's some type of illness in our household, probably 10 months out of the year. So in caretaking of these little ones at home from school recently, I've been doing a fair amount of churchy work, mainly filtering through emails and looking at budgets from my living room, with children running around me or clinging along with me. Recently, one asked as I was typing quickly, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm writing some things for church." She looked at it. She's like, "That's really long." I tried not to be offended. Like, yes, it's very meaningful too. And so then I asked, "What do you think Papa does for church?" And she thought for a moment and she said, "Tell stories and help people." Right. Yes, right. You're right. From the mouths of babes, we're reminded what we ought to be doing with our time. And then I asked, "Why do you think I do those things?" And she thought for a moment, and then she said, "To build a fair and peaceful world?" Oh my God. Yes! So I closed my email. She reminded me, yes, that's what we're doing. That's also part of the chalice lighting they do in religious education here, if you know. I don't know about you, but I know for sure for me that I need people in my life, family, friends, community, whatever, that can name for me and remind me and call me back to who I want to be in this world and how I want this world to be. I need other people, whether they say it plain to me like that or not. Maybe it's from a story someone tells or a question they ask. Maybe in a conversation that makes me think differently or believe differently about something or remember something that I already knew and maybe I had forgotten along the way. And it recalibrates, resets my heart, my soul, like a compass for the soul dropping right into my heart, pointing me again in the direction I need to go. How do you quantify that? Those spaces, those people, those moments, the reminder of who you are and who you want to be. At least in my summation, the value of that, it's beyond measure. I invite you to place your hands over your hearts or to the sky or hold hands if you're good with that. It's all good. And breathe deep the breath of life. In the last 12 hours or so, my wife and I were texting, realizing we hadn't talked about what we were going to pledge to the church yet this year. And then came the hashtag #MinisterFamilyFail. But when it comes down to it, as much as we'll talk about it, we already know the answer. We will give and increase our pledge the way we are able to, the most generous we are able to, because the value that this church and this faith gives us is beyond measure. May we all find love beyond measure. Amen.